じゃあちょっとだけだけどやろうか。これ50分だけどね、これね結構難しいんだよね。
The Americans are losing influence dramatically. Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world of any country. And the Indonesians were strongly pro-US and anti-China 10 years ago. That has now flipped. And it's flipped
フリップトってのは寝返ったとね。
almost completely because of Gaza, which is considered to be a domestic issue
なぜガザかっていうと、インドネシアってイスラム教だからね。
by the Indonesian population and the government.
Ian, where does this podcast find you?
I am at home right now in New York. I'm going to go to my office right after this.
Let's bust right into it. You recently delivered your anticipated 2024 State of the World speech in Tokyo, where you outlined the major themes and forces shaping the geopolitical landscape, including the wars in the Middle East and Russia, the impact of China's managed decline, I love that term, the impending U.S. election and AI. You said we should be most worried about the absence of global leadership. What do you think is driving this leadership vacuum, and who is, if anyone, poised to step in?
I don't think anyone's poised to step in right now. I mean, you look at what's happened in the Middle East over the last year, and the United States is by far the most powerful ally of Israel, but has been basically hands off. And the Israelis have been making the decisions as they choose fit. The Chinese are the most important ally out there, most powerful of Russia on the global stage. They've had no impact on what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine over the course of the last few years, and no one else is close to the Americans or secondarily the Chinese. So I mean, it's not as if there's all sorts of leadership, but not global leadership. It's national leadership. It's leadership at home. It's focusing more on the stuff that you have.
これは保護主義のことを言ってんだね。
Going on in your own country, especially when most people around the world are not comfortable or not happy with the direction that their countries are heading. And we're seeing that play out in elections all over the world.
What is the downside of that? Do you feel, I'll give you an example. It feels like I can't figure out if Israel is ignoring the U.S. or the U.S. is actually quietly coordinating and trying to pretend that they're going against their wishes. You claim, or you state, and it feels obvious now, that Russia is sort of ignoring China. Is that a good thing, where we have a more diverse ecosystem, or do we need one or two superpowers kind of moving the pieces around on the chessboard?
It's a more uncertain thing. Certainly if you're Russia, you like it more. If you're Israel, you like it more. If you're North Korea, you like it more. If you're Iran, you like it more. Generally speaking, countries that want to be able to act unconstrained from the international norms, multilateral architecture, sort of collective security alliances, countries that don't like to be, sort of contained by that, are happier when you have an absence of global leadership. I can tell you quite strongly, Scott, that the Israelis have been ignoring what the United States would prefer. But the U.S. has been unwilling to do very much to try to get that outcome, to be fair, which is very, very similar to what's been happening with the Russians vis-a-vis China. And I'm not trying to suggest that these wars are the same. But I think it's just interesting that if you talk to the Chinese, they'll say, oh, but we support Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. And I can say in response, well, sure, the United States supports a two-state solution. Well, we have pretty good relations with the Ukrainians. Well, the Americans...
彼言ってるのは口では言ってるけど実際には何をやってないよと。
They're doing what they can to get humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. But is that actually happening? And the answer is no. How much effort are these countries willing to deploy? How much political capital to try to ensure that the outcomes they say they want, they're actually getting? And the answer is very little. The answer is very little. And I don't see that changing in either place anytime soon.
So whenever we have you on, we kind of do this round the world, round robin, so to speak. So let's start, and we'll end up with the U.S. election. But first, give us your state of play or your view on the state of the war in the Middle East right now.
So you and I are talking, Scott, on Monday. I know this is coming out on Thursday. Oil prices down 6% today. And why would that happen? Because this round of escalation is over. You know, Israelis hit Iran back after waiting almost a month.
Right? Sort of.
Yeah, no, they hit them back. They did more damage to Iran on the ground than the Iranians did to Israel. I mean, so you could say, I mean, I don't know if you said sort of when Iran hit Israel.
I find the whole thing, the word I would use, I'm curious if you agree with this, the word I would use on both parties, Iran and Israel, is performative.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think that what set this all off, which was the assassination of Hamas's political leader during the inauguration of Iran's president in Tehran, that was not performative. Israeli strikes killing Hassan Nasrallah, who runs Hezbollah, and blowing up Hezbollah's leadership, that's not performative. But the last two rounds, absolutely performative. The Iranians waited for weeks and weeks, and when they finally did engage in strikes, they gave the Americans a heads up in advance, and that ensured that there was going to be minimal damage on the ground in Israel. And the only person that was killed, you may remember, was a Palestinian living in the West Bank, right? And the Israeli response was also restrained. And here, I haven't given the Americans much credit in restraining Israel, but here I think they deserve a little because the United States really wanted to ensure that Israel did not hit Iranian nuclear facilities or energy facilities, and they didn't. And in part, that's because the United States offered.
これだからアメリカがじゃなくてイスラエルがイランの核施設とか石油設備を爆破しないのはアメリカの要求でやってないよと。
Some incentives to Israel over the last few weeks. They fast-tracked the THAAD missile defense, stood it up in less than 2 weeks on the ground in Israel, a new system that they already had one from the U.S. at the beginning of the war. They gave them another. And then they also started sanctioning some of the ships that had turned off their transponders, shipping oil tankers out of Iran, illegally exporting it, breaking U.S. sanctions. The U.S. probably should have done that a year ago, but did that to basically show the Israelis, hey, we're going to ensure these guys have less money to spend on the proxies that are attacking you. And I think that both of those things, plus a little diplomacy, helped restrain Israel's response more than they would have done absent that.
So give me the other side of the argument. Well, I'll put forward an argument. You give me the other side of the argument for de-escalation here. And that is, whether it's the Houthis, Hamas, or Hezbollah, the credit card funding all of this chaos and terror, if you will, is oil revenues coming out of Iran. Wouldn't this sort of cut the head off the snake strategy of going in and basically saying, we're going to start shutting off this credit card unless you stop funding these proxies? And they did not do that. Give me the political calculus for why they did not do that.
I think it's a really good question, Scott. I mean, they're exporting right now over 1 million barrels a day. And the typical argument you'd give, and this is the argument the Americans have quietly given over the last almost 3 years for why Russian export of oil has not been cut off, right? I mean, America's friend, the Indians, are buying an obscene amount of Russian oil, some of which they're refining and then sending on to Europe. And the reason that wasn't cut off is because the U.S. is concerned that that would spike oil prices and lead to a global recession. That's just not true with the 1 million barrels that the Iranians are exporting. OPEC has over 1 million barrels right now that they are holding back. I mean, what's driving prices, which are pretty low, is the fact that there isn't a lot of demand, and particularly the Chinese economy is performing so poorly, Chinese consumption. So given all of that, there's not a really good argument for why you want doing more to cut off Iran, which is why I said I'm a little surprised that the Biden decision to hit these ships with the transponders, they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that 6 months ago, 9 months ago? Like, why are you letting the Iranians export illegally?
これイランのロシアもそうだけど石油を相当輸出してんだけどイランの制裁に対してアメリカがそれを制裁しないのは石油価格の影響を心配してるのね。
Now, some of that, getting all of that million plus off the market would have also involved probably sanctioning some Chinese institutions that the Americans have been loath to do because China is a lot more powerful and has the capacity to hit you back. So, I mean, there's definitely some narrow...
中国の場合はちょっと違ってて、やっぱり中国の経済を圧迫するってことは中国自身も力持ってるからこれヒットバックっていう言葉を使ってくるね。そういう意味でアメリカはそれを警戒してるのね。
Economic self-interest playing out here, but I am in the camp that more can and should have been done to cut off Iranian export. Absolutely.
Russia, Ukraine.
Where we're going, where we are.
Well, state of play, how things have changed. It's, I would argue, the biggest winner or one of the biggest winners of the Middle East conflict has been Putin because it's taken the Western gaze off of Ukraine. And where are we? People haven't been focused on it. What's the state of play on the ground? What do you think 2025 holds for Russia, Ukraine?
Well, Scott, by people you mean Americans, because Europeans are relentlessly focused. They're spending more overall, and they have been, than the United States, something the Americans probably don't appreciate. And they recognize that if Trump comes in and cuts off the Ukrainians, they are going to have to do more. And I think they will. Is it enough for the Ukrainians? That's another question. But this is and will remain a much more existential issue for most of the Europeans who see not only that in many cases they've got a border with Ukraine or a border with Russia, but also they're engaging in all sorts of asymmetric fighting with Russia directly. You know, I mean, if you go on Telegram, I mean, the Russian GRU, I mean, their spies are paying lots of money for locals, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians in many countries across Eastern Europe to engage in acts of espionage, vandalism, arson, other criminality, you name it. This is a war that is being fought on the ground in Europe. It's well beyond disinformation. So they are focused like a laser on what happens going forward. And that conversation, the conversation across Europe has not slipped to the Middle East. It is focused on Russia, Ukraine, where in the United States, Russia, Ukraine is a decided, number two, if even that. So there's a real gap. I'll tell you one thing that I think the media has gotten wrong recently, and because it's attracted a lot of headlines, I think it's worth you and I going into for a couple minutes, is the North Korea angle. People are talking about North Korea and saying it shows desperation, that Russia's going to get 10,000 troops from North Korea, and it means they really can't fight. They can't go anywhere else. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. In the broad scheme of things, 10,000 poorly trained troops from North Korea being sent as cannon fodder to the front lines who don't speak the Russian language, won't be effectively trained or integrated, matters almost.
これ北朝鮮の1万人の兵隊がクルスクに送ってきてるけどトレーニングをしないで送ってきてるけど一体どうするんだろうねって言ってるのね。
None to the fighting. That is not what's going on here. What the North Koreans have done that really matters is a solid majority of all the artillery that is being used against Ukraine and the ammunition being used against Ukraine. That is North Korea. And that means the war. North Korea is absolutely the war machine behind what's happening on the front lines right now. And that's been going on for months and months now. What's interesting about the North Korean decision to send troops is it really solidifies a military alliance that Russia has now signed.
だからロシアと北朝鮮との軍事協定を確定するなんていうことは全く
with North Korea.
考えられない。
It's made them closer to North Korea than the Chinese are. The Chinese are not aware of what the details of that military agreement comprise, and they're deeply discomfited by that. And
中国はさ、deeply discomfort 大変不愉快。
historically, of course, the Chinese are the ones that called the shots for Pyongyang, if anyone did. So that's what's really different here. And the fact that they are, a nuclear weapon state that is developing aggressively much more advanced technology, including like nuclear submarines that the Russians are clearly helping them with, advanced ballistics, maybe even some space stuff.
これは北朝鮮にロシアが原子力の技術を伝えてあげるってことを言ってるのね。
That's a serious problem, and that's something that the Russians are 100% behind.
In the last few months, what has happened on the ground? Have the Russians been making progress? Is it a stalemate? Or the Ukrainian army pushing back? What's the state of play on the ground?
So the big thing that happened, the spectacular thing that happened a couple months ago, is the Ukrainians decided to take almost 40,000 well-trained troops and send them into Russia,
Crazy.
territory of Kursk,
Yeah.
Which they have.
僕は知らなかったけど、彼言ってるのはクルスクにウクライナの兵隊が4万人ね入り込んでる。
Taken, and they have held much of it. They're now losing territory to the Russians, but the Russians have largely ignored that. They've referred to it as terrorism internally, and they have instead sent more troops to inside Ukraine, and they are taking, which is now less well defended, and they are taking more of the Donbass. So I would argue, and most NATO leaders would argue, that this was Zelensky, both with the flair for the spectacular to show that the Ukrainians can still do very unexpected things and cause pain for Putin, and also getting desperate because they're increasingly recognizing that they aren't going to have the capacity to keep fighting the way they have for the last 2.5 years. This is a dangerous move for them. This makes it a lot harder for them to hold their own front lines, with the Russians having already taken about 22% of the country. And
まあウクライナの領土の 22% ロシアが占領してるが、ウクライナの兵隊も容易ではないよと。
threatening to take a lot more. So if you ask me over the next 3-6 months, I think that there's a much higher likelihood that the Russians take all of the Donbass, and that is, going to lead to more
だからロシアの方が攻勢に出てきてるよ。
displacement, and also reduce morale on the part of the Ukrainians. Russia's
ウクライナ軍の兵士も士気が落ちてきてるよ。
also in the last couple of months done unprecedented damage to Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure.
あとウクライナの電力に対してロシアの攻撃を強めている。
As winter approaches, and that's going to make
冬は暖房の
it a much harder winter for the average Ukrainian. Only about 40 million people live in Ukraine right now. There was over 50 million.
以前は5万人以上いたのに以前は5000万人以上いたのに今は4000万人しかウクライナにいない。
Before the war, and those numbers I suspect are going to continue to go down over the next several months.
You referred China
この数ヶ月先ではさらに人口が減少しちゃうよと。
as quote unquote managed decline. That's your term, and I like it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking in part about the relationship between China and the United States. We are heading towards confrontation, but both countries are trying to avoid sudden crises and ensure through a lot of high-level communication that the relationship doesn't deteriorate any faster than it needs to, and any more broadly than it needs to. The Americans are doing that, I think, in part because we've got our hands full with a couple of different wars and an election cycle. The Chinese are doing that because their economy is performing worse than I've ever seen it. Certainly since the early 90s, maybe since the 70s. I was just in Beijing
中国の経済はとんでもない状況にあるよ。
a couple of weeks ago. I spent the week there. And every provincial government is bankrupt. And real estate
地方都市は破産してるよ。
is in crisis. That is 70% of Chinese consumer wealth and about 30% of Chinese government revenue. And they're not going to come close to their 5% growth target
中国は 5% 成長なんかできっこない。
this year. This is a new Chinese economic leadership put in place by Xi Jinping. They are suddenly telling the president, we're not going to be able to perform like we told you we were. Not a good place to be on your first year. And that's also the 75th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So there was a lot of panic going on among the top economists a couple weeks ago in China.
中国はもうとんでもない状況だよということですね。まあこれ1時間47分だけど今20分見てたけどだいたい要約してね、くれましたよね。面白いね。